Our reading from John chapter 7 points to three things. Jesus' ministry was watched and criticized by some of the religious leaders. That people are inclined to turn cultural and common practices into doctrine. And thirdly, that our intrinsic motivation defines who we are and whose we are. It is self-evident that a preacher of Jesus' significance and success would attract a crowd. And in that crowd there would be critics, and critics from the establishment. And they would be there to check whether he was conforming to the doctrines and customs. In this instance, they observed that Jesus' disciples were not washing their hands in the tradition of the elders. And Jesus' reply to them was that they were hypocrites. The point he makes is that they had turned a cultural habit into a doctrine, a law. And Jesus accuses them of teaching human rules as doctrines of the faith. And then he quotes the prophetic work of Isaiah, which goes to the essence of hypocrisy. They honor me with their lips, but they do not love God with their hearts. Lip love rather than heart love. Their intrinsic motivation was to impress, hold to conventions, somewhere in that region, not the love of God. Now let us be careful of judging the Pharisees. That's easy to do. Rather, we should ask ourselves, to what extent do we honor God with our lips but not with our hearts? Throughout the Bible, the prophets of God were calling the people to be faithful. We tend to express our faith through practicing kindness and generosity and justice. Do we ever stop to ask ourselves, is that enough? Have we reduced our faith to something that is convenient for us? Could we be guilty of lip love rather than heart love? I ask you to hold those questions for a moment. Thirdly, Jesus says to them that what makes us unclean is what comes out of us. He said, listen to me, all of you, and understand there's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Now, we should be clear that Jesus is not stating a general principle. He is responding to a particular situation about cleanliness and the right foods to eat and the correct hygiene. Not because those things are bad in themselves, but because the authorities, the religious authorities, have made them an end in themselves. And that's the difference. They've become oppressive rules, regulations, and issues of faith. Whereas trust and love of God is the essence of faith. St. Augustine said, love God and do what you like. That's a great statement, isn't it? Just love God and do what you like. The problem is, or the issue is, that if you really love God, you do what God likes. We might easily say that the intrinsic motivation for a Christian is love. Yes, but what do we mean by that? Do we have the natural ability to love? I don't know about you, but when I look at the world about me, when I listen to the news and read the news and see people, my observation is that the last thing we are capable of is loving like Christ, or even remotely like Christ. It seems that our natural love is extremely limited. To put it another way, it seems that our attitudes to each other seem anything like the love that wishes the best for the other. It is turning to God, the source of life and love, that will grow our capacity to love like God. I read William Wilberforce's letter on the abolition of the slave trade to his constituents. I read it in his language, his English language, of course, but his grammar and syntax and the words he used. It was quite a challenge. But what I discerned was this man who had spent over 30 years campaigning to abolish the slave trade in the British Empire, and he learnt about it in his dying years and months. Wilberforce's inspiration and energy to work for this for so long and endure and continue and persevere was his understanding of God in the Bible and his love for Jesus Christ. He looks to Christ Jesus again and again, and in short, you can't talk about William Wilberforce's concern about justice for the slaves without understanding his personal faith in Christ and his reliance on Christian supporters, and not least, one of them, amongst them, was John Wesley. To understand love, we need to look to Jesus. To look at Jesus involves knowing about Jesus, reflection on Jesus, and a prayerful fellowship with Jesus. I recall when I became a Christian, and forgive me if I use a personal illustration, I decided that I was told you needed to have a quiet time and to pray every day. And so I decided I would set aside 5 minutes every day. I was very generous. I was a teenager, possibly in my 18th year then. And I set aside 5 minutes. I'd pray and read a bit of the Bible. But I realized I needed more time. I got to 10 minutes and then eventually decided I would give 30 minutes a day. But I didn't have 30 minutes. So set my alarm 30 minutes earlier. It wasn't easy. The discipline wasn't easy. I didn't find it always comfortable, and sometimes I think I prayed half asleep. But the motivation was there. And from time to time, I had a sense that God really touched me. The more I reflected on Jesus, the more I was challenged to grow in my faith. And you know, Christian life has its challenges, and we should not look at the Christian life as if it's going to be an easy path, a comfortable path, a conventional path. It's anything like that. Yesterday afternoon, I was the race officer at my sailing club's races in the afternoon at Albert Park Lake. You might have noticed that the wind was up. The gusts were very high. We had so many capsizes before the race began that I called out for the fourth rescue boat. The racing was finally abandoned, and on reflection and talking to others on shore, I learned far more from that experience, that challenging experience on the water, where you're seeing boats and younger sailors in the water for quite a while, and knowing that there's a safety issue. I learned far more through that stressful situation than if it had been a nice sunny afternoon with a light, gentle breeze. I'm reminded of the story of the little sapling. It saw all the big trees around it in the forest, and it wanted to be a grand big tree. And one day the forester walked by and stopped and looked at it, and it said to the forester, "I want to be a big tree like that tree there." The forester said, "Well, if you want to do that, I'm happy to help you." and he pulled out a few plants around the little tree, and he walked off, and he came back every couple of days, and he'd pull a leaf off here and a little branch off there and pull out other things near. And the little sapling began to complain. He said, "You're hurting me. You're taking away all my friends. Why are you doing that?" And the forester said, "Well, if you want to be a grand big tree, you need to make space for the sunlight to strike you so you can grow into a grand big tree." We can't expect to grow close to God and never take on some spiritual discipline that will enable us to grow close to God. I used recently the image that we are made in the image of God, and that means there's a sense that God has made us with a rough, uncut diamond in us. And of course, for the diamond to refract the light beautifully and be something beautiful that beautifies the world, it must be cut and polished. And the matter is appropriate to us. We cannot expect to grow as Christians without some cutting and polishing. I just want to read to you a list of the spiritual disciplines. Inward, meditation, prayer, fasting, yes, and studying. Outward, simplicity, solitude, submission, service, corporate, confession, and worship. The spiritual disciplines help us. We can't take on board all of them. From time to time, we may take on some, but we should make sure that we do have some discipline over our spiritual lives. God invites us to grow so that the image of God can be seen in us. It is fascinating that the ancient prophet Malachi made the same point in chapters 3 in his writings, where he says, "I am sending my messenger." This is God saying to him, "I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. He is like a refiner's fire. He will sit as a refiner and purify. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the descendants and refine them like gold and silver, until they present their offerings to the Lord in righteousness." One of the things I noticed there immediately is not that we just can come and worship, but we need to prepare ourselves for worship. But this image of God sending a messenger that will sit as a refiner and purifier is interesting. There was a little prayer group of women who were studying Malachi, and they came across this, and they wondered what it meant that he, and this is a reference to God, will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. And they wondered what the process was. And they wondered what it might tell us about the character of God. And one of them knew a silversmith, so she said, "Look, I'll make an appointment and I'll go, but I won't tell him we're a Christian group. I'll just go and ask him." So she made the arrangements, and the silversmith was quite happy to entertain her, and he began refining some silver, and he held it over the fire, and he said, "I've got to hold it over the fire at the hottest part of the fire." And she said, "Do you have to sit and watch it?" He said, "Oh yes, I have to sit and watch it. I have to keep my eye on it all the time, because it's got to heat up. But if it overheats, I'll destroy the silver." And she thought about that, and she wondered that he said that he had to keep his eyes on the silver all the time, on the hottest part of the flames, until it was ready. So she said to him, "How do you know when it's ready?" "Oh," he said, "that's the easy part. When I see my image in the silver. If today you are feeling the heat of God's refining fire, remember that God will not take God's eyes off you, nor leave you there a moment too long. God is watching until God can see the divine image emerge in you. And if today you want to embark on a path of drawing closer to God, and it won't be easy, remember that God will not take God's eye off you, nor leave you there for a moment too long. God will watch until God can see God's image in you. May God bless us so that we may reflect the glory of God, and that will be our intrinsic motivation, our love of God.